Hello everybody, my name is Rachel. Welcome to another reading wrap-up. This is a 2-week wrap-up since I didn't do one last week. I've been taking the videos slow and easy this month and just giving myself more time to read and pursue some other interests. I always like to kind of slow down in November and December anyway. I'm always craving quiet and peace and relaxation and not running around like a chicken with my head cut off as we get into the holidays. And every year I'm not very successful at slowing down, but I'm trying really hard this year. Anyway, I have made great progress towards my A to Z challenge for this month, so I have a grand total of 12 things to talk to you about. So buckle up, get some tea. I've got mine right here. This is going to be a long wrap-up. First up is The Citadel of Weeping Pearls by Aliette de Bodard. I loved this novella. It is another of the Shuya universe stories, which I usually really enjoy. And this has probably surpassed everything else I've read by de Bodard as my favorite work by her. Previously, I think it was On a Red Station Drifting, which is another of the Shuya novellas. This one ranks very highly for me because I thought that the plot had a lot more clarity and precision. I always enjoy what the stories are about, but this one stands out because I can explain what's going on without having to explain all of the culture and the society and familial ties and stuff like that. So this is about the Empress of the Dai Viet Empire, who had previously fallen out with her eldest daughter, the princess. The princess went away to the Citadel of Weeping Pearls, and then the Empress sent a force to invade her, and then the Citadel disappeared, like it winked out of existence. 30 years later, everybody assumes that the Citadel is long lost, but the Empress, facing an invasion from the Nam Empire, wants to perhaps repair ties with her daughter and retrieve some of her daughter's technologies and inventions that might help them with their war. So they're trying to find out what happened to the Citadel. There are multiple viewpoints here, including like a military commander investigating the disappearance of a scientist who is looking into what happened to the Citadel, as well as a young woman whose mother had disappeared on the Citadel, and the woman is trying to also find out how to access the Citadel. And it turned into this very touching story about the relationship between the Empress and her children, basically. And I loved the way that the story evolved. I really liked the way that it ended. I understood what was happening, and I thought that a lot of the relationships were very poignant and touching, and it was just really, really good. I'm glad I finally got around to reading this one. Next is Defender by C.J. Cherryh. This is the 5th book in the Foreigner science fiction series. It is the 2nd book in the 2nd trilogy because Foreigner is a series of trilogies. I am rereading these books. I'm buddy reading them with Kazan from Always Doing, and that's been wonderful. Defender being the 5th book, I cannot tell you anything about the plot without majorly spoiling exciting events in the previous book, so I'm not going to say anything about that. This book was a tiny bit of a letdown. The previous book, Precursor, was amazing. It was such a good story, so immensely satisfying. And where Defender faltered for me is that it had a very strong first half and then a relatively unsatisfying second half, which I believe may be a function of its being that middle book in a trilogy. It's starting things but not concluding them, and I just personally didn't love the way some of the characters were acting. I didn't super understand why they were doing what they were doing in the last part of the book. That being said, it was still very, very interesting, and I am very excited to get to the last book in this particular trilogy. My memories of what happens in the first 9 books in the series are very scattered. I'm at a point where I remember things that might happen, but I don't know what books they happen in, so I just want to keep reading to get to the parts that I really remember. So enjoyed, very much looking forward to the next book and my next buddy read with Kazan. Elatsoe by Darcie Little Badger. This is one of my favorite reads of November. It wasn't entirely perfect, but it was so fun to read. I buddy read this with Shannon from That's So Poe, and once again that made it all the better just to have somebody to discuss it with. I loved the world building, so many cool ideas. I really enjoyed the main character Ellie, who is canonically asexual and aromantic on the page. And I liked the depiction of a very loyal and respectful family, very loving, and the themes of responsibility and responsible use of one's powers, and the storytelling, the stories told and passed down throughout generations of the Lipan Apache family in the story. It was wonderful. I'm going to have a separate video where I gush even more about what I enjoyed about this, so look forward to that. I do know that Shannon has already posted her review of this book, and I would highly recommend you go watch that if you want to know more about it. I'm sure her review is much more intelligent than mine was. And next up, I read Hacking Darwin by Jamie Metzl. I listened to this on audiobook, and it's a nonfiction book about the future of humanity's ability to genetically modify our offspring. My big takeaway from this book is that Metzl is very passionate about developing policies and good discussions around the ethics of humans modifying our DNA and tinkering with the DNA of our children. That's kind of the future that we're headed towards. And I think that he basically describes this as inevitable. In fact, he gives many examples of how we're already making decisions based on our knowledge of our future children's genes. So we're on this kind of slippery slope where we need to pause and think about what we're already doing and responsibly deciding how to handle the next stage with things like CRISPR-Cas9 technologies and such. I'm very interested in genetics, and I picked this book up because it is related to genetics, and especially some of that cutting edge stuff with CRISPR and such. And it really turned more into the policies and the ethics of that. And it was really interesting. This turned out to be something that I had been wanting from other books I've read over the past 2 years or so, and hadn't quite gotten. CRISPR in particular has launched a lot of ethics and responsibilities discussions, and this is the first nonfiction book I've read that really incorporates that is fully about that, and brings in a lot of the very, very recent scientific experiments and things that people have done using these technologies that are not necessarily ethical. But it was a fascinating listen, and I'm really glad that I read it, and I would recommend it if you're interested in the topic of genetics and the discussions we're having today about where to go next with that. Imago by Octavia Butler. This is the third and last book in the Xenogenesis series, which I had been meaning to finish for years. I'm finally done with it. I talked about Adulthood Rights, the second book, in my last wrap up, and I have pretty much the same things to say about Imago as I said about Adulthood Rights. This is a science fiction tale about a sort of alien invasion that massively changes the human race on a biological genetic level and changes the way that humans will reproduce in the future. And it is forced. There's no consent basically here. So I think now that I'm at the end of this trilogy, now that I've read Imago, this is a really great story about an alien species, an alien way of viewing biology and genetic legacy and reproduction, and also relationships. It is alien. It is also sometimes deeply uncomfortable because it does not conform to humans' sense of morality or ethics or how to conduct relationships and stuff. And I found that very challenging. So while I appreciated the science fiction and the biology and the alien culture, the stories, particularly Imago, are about basically human alien constructs, hybrids, looking for mates to like biologically bond with. And these situations always come across as very non-consensual. Information is actually withheld from humans so that they will make one decision without realizing how trapped they are or the consequences of their decisions, which really gets under my skin. And I think probably what it comes down to is I have this very personal, emotional reaction to a lot of the themes and the relationships in the story, because the idea of being tricked into a relationship that you can never get out of except with death, and then being forcibly impregnated or misled into pregnancy sounds to me like the worst possible thing. Like, it's a nightmarish scenario for me. Just thinking about that gives me the willies. I mean, you're talking about rape, something that comes across as almost abusive, like an abusive relationship, and then forcible impregnation. And that's very difficult for me to not see it that way, let's say. So it's good. It is so incredibly thought-provoking. I think that reading this is probably just a good experience because it is well written, and it'll make you feel a certain way, and then you have to think about why did you have that reaction. So while I might very much disagree on a fundamental level with some of the things going on in these stories, I'm glad that I read them. Wow, I got really carried away there, and I have no memory of what I just said, so it may have gotten completely off of the point. Let's move on to the next book. Lithium 6 by Risto Isomaki. This is translated from Finnish by, I think, Owen Witesman. If I've gotten his name wrong, I'll leave it down in the description. I had previously read one other book by Isomaki, a climate change science fiction novel called The Sands of Sarasvati, which I read the novel version. There's also a graphic novel version, but I didn't read that adaptation. I think I actually have a review of that up on my channel. It's been some years, but I'll dig that up and link it for you. And I was quite impressed by the scientific concepts in that. It felt like very much a Hollywoodized climate change story, and I enjoyed it. And it turns out that Lithium 6 is very similar. It is basically about the theft of radioactive elements or elements that could be used to make catastrophic atomic bombs, and some people in different countries trying to find out who has stolen these materials and what they're planning on doing with them and who is being threatened. And it also has that Hollywood action movie feel to it. The concept was interesting. I'm pretty sure that Isomaki has actually written a nonfiction book about the nuclear energy ideas in this. I think that might be kind of his pet topic, in fact. So the scientific concepts in this were once again the things that I thought were the strongest, much like in The Sands of Sarasvati. But the way that it was written, the characters felt pretty flat and one-dimensional to me. I did not like the way that a lot of the women were written. One of the major female characters is massively fridged in the story, and another one is a prostitute who is constantly needled in a really abusive way by one of the men in the story, and that left a bad taste in my mouth. And then the action, the way that the plot worked, it really felt like I was watching a Hollywood action movie, and those are certainly not very believable sometimes. So it was an interesting story. It kept my attention the whole way through, but it certainly had some elements that really annoyed me, unfortunately. I couldn't really give it more than about 3 out of 5 stars. But then something that I knew I was going to enjoy from the beginning, and that was Masquerade in Lodi by Lois, McMaster, Bujold. I don't actually know if I'm saying Lodi correctly, but that's just the way it looks like it should be pronounced to me. So this is another of her Penric and Desdemona novellas that just came out. I think it was published in October. It is actually out of chronological order, so it's like 8th or 9th in publication order, but it actually takes place between the events of Penric's Fox and Penrick's mission, which was very interesting to me because I had previously theorized that was a period of time that Bujold might never show in a story and merely allude to some of the events, because it was a very difficult period in Penrick's life, and it involved a suicide attempt. And it doesn't exactly address that particular thing, it does mention it. So once again, Bujold hasn't gone through and like filled it in that bit. I don't know if she ever will, but it gives you another glimpse of that period in Penrick's life. This particular little escapade takes place in Lodi and involves Penrick and Desdemona trying to capture an insane demon that is possessing a man and encountering a young woman who is a saint, and I liked it very, very much. It wasn't the best, it wasn't my favorite out of these novellas, but it is so wonderful to be back with Penrick and Desdemona, and the world is wonderful. I love the theology. It's great. It was a very comforting and good read. Then for the letter O, I decided to read this random sci-fi comic that I came across just because the artwork looked interesting, and that is Ophiuchus by Ali Leriger de la Plante and Natasha Terapetrovic. I believe this was originally a webcomic that was then picked up by Image and more traditionally published. And I think there may have been a little bit of something lost in that translation from a webcomic and like website experience to just the print comic. And it is a pretty simplistic, sweet, straightforward story about some characters. Some of them are like robots or constructs who go on this mission to confront a virus that has been like taking over the galaxy. It was interesting, but like I said, it was kind of simple and it was easy to tell what was going to happen. My biggest struggle with it is that the artwork was beautiful. It has this very evocative but simple color palette, and the artwork is very stylized. It has this very flat geometric look to it. I really like the way that it looks. Unfortunately, it was so heavily stylized that it could not convey emotions, expressions, body language, or physical action pretty much at all, and that was very confusing. There would just be panel after panel where I couldn't figure out, are the characters talking to each other? Are they looking at each other? Are they moving? You know? And there were sometimes instances where that really limited color palette meant that the foreground had such a low contrast with the background that I would miss things like speech bubbles. So that was frustrating. It looked pretty, but it was really difficult to read and parse the action in it. So it was a perfectly fine read in one evening. I would probably read more comics created by the authors and illustrators, but this particular one was just, it was all right. Moving on from that, I read Permafrost by Alistair Reynolds. This is a science fiction novella about trying to save the future of the human race and the planet using time travel. There's been this event in the future called the Scouring, which I don't completely understand. I don't know if it was very specifically explained or not, but basically insect life disappears and they have a very difficult time growing crops and having sufficient food sources. They're on the verge of the human race collapsing from lack of food and nutrition. And there is this project called Permafrost that is trying to use some time travel techniques to recover something from the past to help in the modern day with their problem with the food stocks. I actually really liked the way that time travel was done in this, where the people are sent back kind of in their consciousnesses to like a host body that they kind of take over. And the story actually focuses a lot on that, and the narrator, Valentina, her experience going back into the body of Tatiana, this woman, and talking to her. And I really like that. It had a very, very strong beginning. I was really getting into the world and the problem. And then it just felt like it had a rather rushed ending. I felt like the story could have been twice as long to pace it better. Like it spent so much of the novella talking about Valentina's experience with time travel for the first time and talking to her host, and then very, very little time on the actual action and the point of them doing that. So it was good. I really enjoyed listening to it on audiobook, and I thought it should have been longer. As you might be able to tell, I've been deviating a lot from my original A to Z TBR, and partly that's been giving into my reading whims, but also I've had some library holds come in that I had forgotten about. And that's the case with the letter U. I ended up reading Untouchable by Talia Hibbert. This is one of her romance novels in the Ravenswood series. It was the last one that I needed to read out of that series, and it was all right. It's a contemporary romance novel about Hannah Kaba and what's his name? I can never remember the men's names from this series. All their names are so similar. It's not Evan, it's not Zach. Nick? Maybe. Anyway, they meet, they had like childhood crushes on each other, and they get it on. I think this one probably didn't work for me so well because of the children/nanny childcare situation. I did not have any interest in the kids, and Hannah is hired to be the live-in nanny. This is all perfectly fine, and there was some good discussion about Hannah ending up in a relationship with her employer and how they needed to handle that. But otherwise, I wasn't really into the characters. I wasn't into their situation, and it was relatively predictable. The angst portions of the books in the series have never gone down super well for me, especially because they're always kind of based on lack of communication and misunderstandings, and I think that Hibbert is so good at writing characters that are good at communicating that the breakdown of communication is often not very believable for me. So Untouchable was fine, but my favorite book in this series was definitely That Kind of Guy, which has demisexual representation, and I thought it was a really, really solid story. Untouchable was another all right installment. I say that, and yet I'm pretty sure that Hibbert is my favorite romance novelist right now. Anyway. Unfortunately, I'm going to end on a bit of a sour note because the last book I have to talk to you about is The XY by Virginia Bergen, which I obviously read for the letter X. I think this letter is cursed. I have never read a truly good book for it. Unfortunately, and there's so few titles to pick for this letter, so there are not a lot of options. So The XY is also known by the title Who Runs the World, and it is a book from my Otherwise Award winners TBR for this year, so it did win that award. I have nothing good to say about this. It's basically like not exactly a dystopian sci-fi novel, but it's set a couple generations in the future in a world completely run by women because a virus kills most of the men, and the men are immediately sent into these protective sanctuaries. So most of the women in the world have never encountered men, don't really understand what men are. And I'm saying things like men and women, but the story is actually trying to focus at the chromosome level. The virus kills people with XY chromosomes and doesn't kill people with like XX chromosomes. What this book gets wrong, I think, is its depiction of gender and biological sex. It tries to put everything in terms of male and female, and it ignores trans people, it ignores intersex people, it ignores non-binary individuals. It's trying to say something about what is a man, what is a woman, and I don't think you can have that discussion about this definition, about what that means, while leaving out everybody who doesn't fall into the gender binary. A lot of people have said that they think this book is basically turfy drivel, you know, like trans exclusionary radical feminist BS basically. I did not get the feeling that Bergen is a turf. I felt like she was trying to write about something she did not completely understand, didn't research very well, and had no interest in getting into the nuances of. She wanted to tell something in a very specific way, and there were like these blinders on, and it failed at what I think it wanted to talk about, and it felt very, very exclusionary in perhaps an unintentionally hurtful way, but still kind of hurtful. So that aside, like, I thought that most of the plot was a mess and a lot of it just wasn't nuanced enough. But what really turned me off of this was the way that it was written. It was just so horribly written. I was irritated by every sentence in this. I'm sorry, I'm pretty sure my opinion on this is that Bergen's writing skills were not up to the challenge that she set for herself, and I thought the tone and the voice of the story was massively irritating. I don't really want to talk about it much more than that. I could sit here and rant about it forever. For the life of me, I don't know why this book won the Otherwise Award. I usually don't sit here and try to discuss why or why not books won awards or whatever, but given that the Otherwise Award is about exploration of gender in speculative fiction, and given that many of the recent winners of this award have been about trans or non-binary characters, have been intersectional and also written by authors of color or non-binary or trans authors, this book sticks out as a sore thumb. It comes across like just very narrow, white, feminist, outdated sci-fi that isn't written very well, and I don't think it meets the criteria for this award, and I don't think it was done well enough to even expand discussion of gender in speculative fiction. So why did it win? I'm gonna stop my whining there. I do not recommend this book. I did not enjoy reading it, and I have nothing good to say about it. Oh yeah, my tea is cold now. I've been sitting here talking for a very long time. Those are all the books. Those are the things I have to talk to you about today. Let me know if you've read any of these. I would love to know your thoughts on them, so leave me a comment down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll be back to talk to you about the next batch of books next week, probably. And until then, bye.